Another book review of the Ragamuffin Gospel. It's due the 28th. The one thing I did for this one, I didn't do for the last one. I put in 3 groups of questions that you can choose either a group and to focus on in the writing of that review, or you can pick and choose out all 3 groups. It's up to you. So essentially you've got 6 different questions to choose from. If you want to take one group and specifically focus on that for the paper, you can do that, so that it just helps structure kind of what you're doing with the book. So, okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, we've got 3 more sections to get through. We're going to be doing boundaries today. Otherwise known as Boundaries 2.0, because of course you guys are experts, so I can go to the next level with y'all. And then forgiveness, and then conflict, which you're all experts at as well. And then we have our last hurrah with intimacy. So that's the roadmap. So let me pray. Let me get us started here. Father, we invite you into this time. We invite you to, not that you aren't already here, but at the same time, the biggest difference between living in your presence and experiencing you is our awareness and our focus on the fact that you are here. And I pray that you will guide us into a greater and greater understanding of the kind of people we want to be, that don't hide behind stained glass, the people that desire to be known and know others, the desire to show grace in very profound ways, not in any way that kind of knocks somebody off their feet, but just the fact that they walk away and have a clear understanding that they are of value just because they exist, not because of what they can do for us. And so guide us into that, and also just allow us the opportunity to trust one more time and continue to trust your heart for us and what it means in terms of these characteristics that we're trying to cultivate in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so where we left off is, and I just want to kind of do a brief reprise, because I know it was a while ago since we did the whole boundary stuff. But I also want to try to connect some dots in the fact that, we spent the first half of the semester more or less trying to unpack, the scandal of grace, the comfort of shame, the ways in which we, tend to try to present ourselves to the world because of our abiding beliefs that we have about ourselves and about others, which oftentimes is exactly the same. The beliefs we have about ourselves versus somebody else. If we really wanted to know whether or not that they held that belief, we'd have to sit them down and ask. But most of the time we don't, and we just assume. So where we turned our attention to then was these 6 different kind of aspects or dimensions or characteristics of what I'm calling pure glass people. The people that are willing to live in the truth and with the truth. The people that are willing to grasp reality as it is, not as they would have it to be, and live within it, and allow even some of the pain that comes with it to exist without trying to push it away or package it up or make it easier for other people to look at, or any of those things. And then from there we went to control versus trust, and I made the assertion right out of the gate that control and trust cannot coexist. And fundamentally, all of these things are building blocks for the biggest thing, which is really the crescendo at the end of this semester when we start talking about intimacy. By the time we get there, we have already defined intimacy. Don't miss that point, because it sometimes you get to that and we hold that up as the thing that we desire most in our relationships, when in fact we're not willing to do the really hard work of working within these areas that we're talking about and cultivating the kinds of things that are necessary. Because Brene Brown defined courage as speaking fully from one's heart, and that's required for all of these dimensions that we've been talking about. And the one thing I want you to keep in mind, something I was reminded of, is the fact that deep knowing of yourself leads you to a deep knowing of God. And a deep knowing of God leads you to a deep knowing of yourself. We somehow get this strange idea that self-knowledge is fundamentally selfish. But then what do we have to give away if I don't really know what it is that's there? Or I pick and choose the things that are there because I think certain ones will be acceptable and other ones will not, which really puts me right outside the whole idea of grace at all. Because grace is saying we are acceptable without us being it first. And we come to God embracing kind of this idea of grace, but we come to him in very much of a shame-based way. Because I'll show some things to God and other things I won't. Well, how do I do that? God's the safest being in the universe to show our stuff to, right? But there's two sides of that coin. The other side of the coin is believers in Christ, the people with whom you're in community with. Why is that such a big deal? Because there's risk. And without risk, you're not going to have trust, and you're not going to find out things about God through others that you would not find just by yourself sitting there meditating and contemplating what God's all about. Because it's shown to us. It's shown to us by how people respond. And don't miss that point, because even when we talk about confession and forgiveness, even in Scripture, there are two sides of a coin again. Confess your sins to God and confess your sins to one another. We forget the second part. Do the first part really well, because in some sense, there is a lot less risk. So, just as a quick review, what are boundaries anyway? We went through kind of these pairings of words, being me and not me. The idea that we are in the spiritual world, we are committed to and owning ourself and what goes on within ourselves. What I'll have you notice even in Proverbs, and I showed you this when we walked through this before, but it talks about your bitterness as well as your joy. We only choose joy to share. It's not the bitterness we share, because it's risky and because we battle our own image of the kind of people that we would label as bitter. And we don't want to appear that way, which gets in the way ultimately. So then we also looked at 2 and 4, being responsible to versus being responsible for somebody else, and looked at Galatians 6:2, and I referred to that as the boulders and backpacks, because basically that's the words that Paul is using. The idea of bear one another's burdens, which is the boulder part of this, and it takes some measure of someone's willingness to admit that they have boulders they're walking around with, and the other part of it is us being lovingly discerning about what exactly does the other person need. Not everybody is carrying a boulder, even though to them it feels that way. And that's really gray area. Because if they define it that way, then isn't it so? Not necessarily. Because the intersection, remember what I said about truth, and big T and little t truth. It is the intersection of reality with how one perceives things. That's the little t. So we looked at that, and fundamentally, this is one of the things that everything turns on, is being responsible to someone, is calling them to carrying the daily responsibilities that are rightfully theirs. Being responsible for somebody is helping them carry something that no one can possibly carry, like grief, like loss. Those things we think, well, it just happens. It's just part of life. What's the big deal? But the fundamental kind of destruction that comes with not dealing with loss and grief very well is something that ends up doing something that Brene Brown talked about, in the fact that you turn off one emotion, you turn off them all. The numbing effect. So 2 and 4. Another one that we looked at was the good in and the bad out. Boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are fences. They're fences that demarcate what I am responsible for and what I am not responsible for. But all fences need gates in them. And that means, who is the gatekeeper? And ultimately, the bottom line is, you are the gatekeeper for your own heart. Imagine for a moment that in that backyard of yours, there was an incredibly precious well there, and you're not going to open the gate and let just anybody come in and destroy the thing and do everything else. You're going to pick and choose who comes in and looks at, appreciates, maybe even draws from that well, and has a life-giving experience through you. But you can't do that if you're not taking care of your heart. And that's, so boundaries or the fences that we keep have to have gates in them, and you're the only one that can be the gatekeeper. You give it over to somebody else, and they will not protect your heart. It doesn't mean they're trying to be mean. It doesn't mean any of that stuff. But what? Look at the verse before. I'm the only one that knows the joys and bitterness of my heart. Nobody else does. Now, we can label it and use the same words, but it's still not the same. How you experience joy is different than how I do. We use the same word. How you experience loss and grief and fear and anxiety is different than I do. We still use the same word. So we have to be mindful of the fact that just because the words are the same, the experience is not. What does that sound like? Big T and little t truth intersecting. Big T truth is we describe things by the same words. Little t truth is, but we experience those words in a very different way. And being mindful of that is important. So, Boundaries 2.0 includes what I would call kind of guideposts. And just out of my own boredom, I decided to put them in a format to make them a little bit easier to remember, using David Letterman's top 10. If I can ever get this to work the way I want it to.
Everybody, it's time for tonight's top 10 list. Let's go.
So you get the idea. The top 10 guideposts. Now, John Townsend and Henry Cloud, when they wrote the boundaries, they called these laws. And myself and two other friends of mine worked really closely with John and Henry when they wrote that book, because we wrote the companion devotional for boundaries. And I said to them, I remember having this conversation, I said, why did you have to call them laws? Because laws are immutable. They don't ever change. And when we're talking about relationships and boundaries, I think it's a moving target. And we probably need to look at them as what I'm proposing, they don't know it, as guideposts. As something that tells me where I am and what kinds of things I need to pay the most attention to. So we'll start at number 10 and work our way up to the last one. And the very first one, it goes this way: I can't live by what I don't see. And this is the guidepost of exposure. And in a lot of cases, when we're talking about boundaries, we spend more time talking about them than we actually live by them. And in a lot of cases, we need to live in such a way that our boundaries are clear. Now, sometimes that's words, and sometimes that's just simply having our choices betray or show that we have boundaries. And that may mean a non-response to somebody, or it may be a response to somebody. And that's what makes it hard, right? Because if I just don't respond, then what is there for anybody to notice? But something shifts in a relationship when in days gone by, you regularly did something and now you don't. And initially the person may not notice, but then over time, and you begin to develop a trend of not responding to their kind of fishing lures of do this for me, and you don't chew on the bait, sooner or later something will happen. In a lot of cases, they'll get frustrated because you're violating the rules of engagement. And boundaries help us make decisions about engaging in relationships in very intentional ways that will enhance that relationship. So the key here is I am going to live out my boundaries. It is not a matter of getting people to comply with my boundaries. It has nothing to do with that. And see, that's where a lot of people grind their gears about this whole boundary thing, because they say, well, why do it if the other person doesn't go along with it? Well, I got news for y'all. Is that most of the relationships you're in or will be in the future will be people that say, when you have good boundaries, they are not going to stand up and applaud you and say, oh, thank you for having good boundaries. They won't. I'll just forewarn you. They'll push and they'll poke and they will question and they will tell you how mean you are and they'll tell you how distanced you are. They'll use all the manipulative words they can find to have you collapse your boundaries, and then they say, finally, we're connected again. No, we're fused again. And that's the biggest challenge with boundaries is we think in enmeshed ways while we're trying to have boundaries. And you can't do both. And the one principle I add to this all the way through it is whenever you're in a relationship with somebody and you want something from them, all right? I'm not talking about a commodity, all right? I want your car. No, I want your approval. I want you to be pleased. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to be happy. All of that, guess what? I am not going to have boundaries with them. And when the boundaries collapse, it will not be their fault. It will be me collapsing them and coming from inside to try to fix them. And now who doesn't have any boundaries? Both people do. So we have to be mindful of that. And usually the first place I start when people come to me and start talking about, I don't know what to do with these boundaries things and everything else, the place I start is asking in my mind, I may not ask them initially, is what is it they're fishing for from the other person? What is it they're fishing for? Because if they want something, they're not going to have boundaries with them. That's mutually exclusive in most cases that I have seen. So that's number 10. Number 9, we have a problem with setting limits. We just don't have any. And this is the guidepost of activity. We cannot sit back and just hope that boundaries will work now that I know it so well. There are a lot of smokers that know everything about nicotine, but they keep smoking. And that's true for a lot of the things that we wrestle with in our lives. Until knowledge is wrapped with commitment and experience, it probably is not going to make any difference. And so the idea that we need to be active in setting, communicating where our boundaries are, and being careful that when we do, we're not throwing shame at people. We're not doing the shame throwing thing. Now, the thing to keep in mind with this, okay, is that if you communicate, like this is saying, being active and setting and communicating your boundaries, and you're careful to allow the person to have the right to choose whether to comply or not comply, and then you have to think through the boundaries again and all that. You have to be careful that if they sink into shame, don't come out from your boundaries. It's their thing. Okay? Because in a lot of cases, when we do boundaries well and the other person starts sinking into, oh, I'm so awful, I've busted through your bound, blah, 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 blah. I can't do anything right. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm never going to get it right. It will be forever and ever and ever. And guess what wells up in you? Oh, I feel so sorry for them. And guess what happens next? The boundaries collapse. Because people, us included, we will not take responsibility for something as long as we know there's somebody in my world that will do it for me. Welcome to your original nature. We won't. I've seen it in relationships way too many times. Is that if somebody is busy taking care of the relationship and say, let's just put it on a 100% scale, and they're spending 80 or 85% worrying about, thinking about, taking care of the relationship, guess how much the other person is going to take? 100? Nope. 85? Nope. 10? Closer. It's complementary. Somebody takes 80, the other person says, great, have at it. I'll go the 20 route. And the challenge of living covenantally is equally committed to the other person, irrespective of what they do. That's the key to covenant living, okay? Contractual living, 80-20, 50-50. You hear that in our culture all the time. It ain't 50-50. If it's a contract, sure. And contracts always limit what people do. It doesn't set people free to do and live graciously with one another. Yes, Sierra?
Just when you were saying, like, when you do bring up an issue and then somebody kind of, like, they start spiraling into shame.
Yeah.
How do you balance, like, continuing to keep your boundaries, I guess, but then, like, encouraging them to not go that way?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
as best as you can, being like, it's not, like, I'm not wanting you to go that way, but not, like, compromising your boundaries then to make sure they don't.
Right, and I think what happens is when we see people kind of sinking, we just keep charging on. We really do. I mean, it's like, well, Mitch told me, leave them be, let them sink. See ya, have a great day. No, I don't. I think the conversation changes from what was originally the conversation to what's happening here. Tell me how you're processing this. So now we have that conversation, okay? And it can be the invitation out of the rat hole of shame, and we're talking about shame and grace and the things that you guys are learning about. We tend to see somebody sink, and we know it. We can see it happening in their eyes. And we don't comment about that because we've got our agenda that we want to try to drive, and then we've missed a precious and powerful moment of connection with the other person. So we get so devoted to the thing that we want to say that we forget about being devoted to the person that we're in the relationship with. And that's usually where a lot of people miss things. The one thing that I think it's safe to say most people get fairly annoyed in my presence when we're talking is the minute something happens, because I'm watching all the time, and people hate it. They absolutely hate it. And we're talking all the time, and I see something kind of run across somebody's face. I say, time out. Wait. What just happened there? And they say, I don't know. Yes, you do. That's a bunch of bull. Yeah, you do. But you're not willing to admit it. That's fine. Let's move on. Next time. I mean, that's, if you want the key to connecting with somebody, then don't be as concerned to say something important as it is to watch what's going on between you. That's the stuff of a relationship. It is not always about words. It's oftentimes about loving one another enough to catch the person in the moment when they sneak their little face out behind the stained glass, checking to see if you're really going to be safe or not. It's like, hi, come on out. No, Alexis goes, oh, no, don't you do that. And we wonder why our stained glass never changes. You all feel really uncomfortable, aren't you? Okay. Number 8. I want what you have. Is that a problem? This is otherwise defined as envy. Envy defines what is good by what I do not possess, and hate that good which I do have. We talked a little bit about this, is the role that envy tends to play. And we always tend to, and I'll tell you, my constant growing edge in my life is around this issue. Because I do the comparisons like everyone else, and somebody that's more successful in an area that I want to be successful in, I say what I have doesn't matter. It's unimportant. It's not good. And what you have is. Always. And I'm finally to the place of recognizing what's going on in that. And so this is where comparison comes in, and that whole demand in our hearts that we are entitled. We love to beat other people up about their sense of entitlement. But then we've got this secret little, subterranean river running underneath that, with all this comparison and everything else, that says whatever somebody else does is always better than what I have. And that interferes. Again, this is similar to when I want something from somebody else, I'm not going to have very good boundaries with them. If I want what the other person has, then I'm not going to have very good boundaries either, because envy will corrode my ability to live within myself, live within my experiences, live within the things that God has brought into my life. In a lot of cases, the difficulty, the discomfort, the other things that we're feeling always is worse than the joys and the blessings and all the other stuff that people are talking about, which is usually just that. Is they just have polished up their stained glass better than everybody else has. So envy is a kind of subterranean thing that's kind of hard to identify at times. And I think a lot of times it comes out in this comparison thing and the other thing that we tend to do. And so that is number 8. Number 7, I don't have to demand my rights, I just live them. Now, this is very similar to exposure. But this is the guidepost of what we call proactivity. The one thing that you will notice in a lot of the parables Jesus tells, particularly the one where the master gives his servants, various levels of talents or denarii or whatever it is, and then he leaves for a period of time, and then he comes back. And the one that is busted the hardest is the one that does nothing. And he calls us to move into the world. He calls us to move into relationships, to take the initiative. Something I said yesterday, because the other section is a dimension behind you guys. And something I said yesterday, I've been kind of rolling it over my mind for a while, and it finally crystallized, is that grace opposes earning, but it does not oppose effort. But the effort that I've set forth is driven by what I've been given already, not to try to gain something I haven't. Okay? So grace empowers. I've said this at the beginning of the course. Grace empowers us to make the very change we want, which means I don't just sit back and say, okay, change happens. No. I have to engage it somehow, and that's what this guidepost is spending less time talking about our boundaries and more time making decisions according to them. See, I had a student sit in my office last night, and we were talking about some of the interactions between her and her parents, and she's going to get married, and the parents were being very conditional and very, if you, then, this is what we'll do. and time and again, I kept kind of pointing to your decisions are all contingent on somebody else's behavior of some sort. So boundaries is every bit as much activity, demonstrating, showing where the boundaries are, as it is decision making that boundaries has now kind of infiltrated my thinking. And I think in terms of these things. Again, it's not about separation. It's not about any of those things. It's just being responsible for me. That's it. Now, you can say, well, man, oh man, you're creating a platform for people to be really self-absorbed and selfish. Yeah. But I guess we're gonna err on one side of the fence or the other. We will. It's just which side of the fence do I want to err on? With the overabundance of clarity and formula and steps and do it all right and all that stuff, or erring on the side of I trust God and His movement in my life, which also means I'll probably make some mistakes, but I'd rather be driven by grace and what had been pronounced as acceptable than driven by how can I prove that I am. And we're going to make an error in one of those two directions. We always will. And so can we go out on the extremes? Yeah, everybody, you know, everybody I've ever come in contact with, when I start talking about boundaries, they create this extreme caricature of what boundaries are to argue their point that Christians shouldn't have any. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. Because they think it interferes with servanthood or service, that people will be so concerned about their boundaries, they'll be so self-consumed. And the reality is that a reservoir helps people more than a ditch. I take care of what's in that reservoir. It serves many, 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 many people. It overflows into people's lives. But if I have a ditch and I throw water in it, it'll flow right through and flow right on, and it goes back to being dry all over again, just like a well. So, number 6, if I eat a pound of M&Ms, will my dentist be upset? What does that have to do with anything? The guidepost of evaluation. See, we have to figure out, again, discernment is required, how to distinguish between doing harm to somebody else versus hurting someone else. Now, what does that have to do with a pound of M&Ms? Other than they are the most delightful thing ever. This is mine, so get the heck out of my yard, dude.
My yard has a sign that says it's a
But okay, I can have target practice later. If I eat a pound of M&Ms and I develop a cavity and go into my dentist, and the dentist says, you got a cavity, and it's like, it's fine. I'm fine. Whatever. But he says, the only way that I can repair this thing is to drill it out, fill it up, and make sure it doesn't come back. Ouch. You know, dentists are the most sadistic people in the world. They put iron hooks into your mouth and drills and wood carpentry things into your mouth all the time. It hurts all the time. But it is a hurt that leads to healing. We confuse that. Now, that doesn't make me higher than anybody else, or I'm trying to do something to anyone else. But I think because of our confusion around doing things that really do harm somebody, that really do bust through their boundaries and take over their lives and do things for them that I should have no business doing, is harmful. On the other hand, having good, clear boundaries makes it possible for a healthy relationship to flourish, and at times may hurt, but it leads to intimacy. It leads to intimacy. We don't see it that way. what interferes with our ability to do boundaries very well is our commitment to other people's comfort. That's what interferes with us having very good boundaries. And now who's responsible for the other person's comfort? Me. Do I have power to accomplish that? No. Maybe you and I should resign as being directors of the universe. So we have to develop the ability, like it says here, to discern the effects of my decisions on others and focus on this idea of discernment over judgment. Being mindful of those things. It doesn't mean it will work every time. It doesn't mean any of those things. And that's the problem with these guideposts, is that remember, they're guideposts. They're not guarantees. There is no such thing in human relationships. There isn't. We'd like to make it that way. And that's why we try to maintain all the control that we can, because I can create this artificial world of the person cooperating with me. And the only way they cooperate with me, bottom line, is because they want me to be comfortable, so they can cooperate with my control efforts. So what do we land in is a fairly superficial, shallow relationship of trading control methods between two people, rather than the riskiness of the intimacy we're talking about. Okay, number 5, I serve to be free, or I'm free to serve. This guidepost is the guidepost of motivation. And the thing to keep in mind, and we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about excellence versus perfectionism. But our commitment to service flows out of our motivation because of how we have been served. It is not driven by obligation, because the minute it is driven by obligation, I lose my freedom. And before too long, I grow resentful because I have to do it. And that takes us back again to the idea of trust versus control. Trust is about freedom. Whenever obligation or duty or whatever happens, it seeds our soul with resentment. And that seed grows into a harvest of bitterness. The thing is, and remember that the idea of serving out of freedom is a volitional choice we make. We choose to do that. Now, when I choose, I'm making that choice to serve another person. Will it be convenient? No, it won't. Will it be uncomfortable? Yes, it will. Will I get resentful? I can, and I can turn it into an obligation, and then suddenly my freedom, my commitment to the other person turns into something that they never intended at all. So motivations matter. Some of you guys have heard me say this over and over again. I pay less attention to behavior. Not that behavior is unimportant. I'm not saying that. If anything, it betrays what I believe. But we've got to keep an eye on motivation, because motivations take us to the heart of the matter, namely you. It takes you back to the well, because we get tempted to pay attention to all this downstream behavior that the Sermon on the Mount really fundamentally is all about. It's getting back to the heart. So when Paul talks about God loves a cheerful giver, it's a free giver. It's somebody that gives because they choose to, not somebody who's obligated. And our tendency is to turn it into that so we can see, well, I did do it. I did it for 4 Sundays out of 5. I'm really good. And before too long, we create our own little private form of Phariseeism all over again. So we have to be mindful of what goes in. All right, number 4, if they are my problem, then they are my problem. This is the guidepost of respect. It adds to this idea that boundaries are not based on a committee vote. I don't get people around me and say, is this a good boundary? But it's based on a clear and realistic assessment of my own needs. Now, the minute I say that, it can get turned into, well, you're inviting people to be selfish again. But remember, we had this conversation. Living within, admitting, and accepting the fact that I have needs does not make me needy. Neediness, in most cases, is manipulative. It's manipulating people into meeting something that I don't want to admit I have. So if we're seeking approval from others, the they in this case, well, we will struggle to maintain healthy boundaries. I've already said that in other terms. I can tell you, and maybe in some of your groups this has happened, some of the people in my groups it's happened, is that when we start talking about us and they and them and everything else, we usually are hiding. When I force people to use the personal pronoun I and me, suddenly they feel something very, very different. Because ownership is a matter of I and me. We're not home. Ownership is more of a matter of I and me. Diffusing it is looking for other people to take responsibility or to try to find a way to diffuse the responsibility that I know I have. When people talk about that, they tend to kind of lump everybody in with them. And I've had that happen. I had it happen in one of my groups, and somebody was trying to encourage another person, and they globalized it. Well, I don't think that I don't think that I'll just stick with we. I don't think that we feel that way. And I said, wait a minute, you can't talk for anybody else. What do you feel? What do you think? And then suddenly we have a real conversation because we're talking about I and me, not us and them. And that's an important aspect, I think, of this. So when we use the word they, more often than not, this happened when I was talking to a student yesterday. She said that same thing. She said, everyone does blah, blah, blah. You know the rest of the phrase, whatever. Everyone, everybody, all them, all those, all that. And I say, stop a minute. It's not everybody. It's two specific people. Let's just be clear, shall we? Because we don't want to make the mistake, because we've gotten drilled with this too, is to blame somebody. Remember something, please. Description is not the same as blame. Describing clearly the situation you're in with someone and saying it as it is not blaming them, it's describing the situation from your own vantage point. Now, if I say, but I'm doing all this stuff because they do that, now we're into blame. Now we're into blame. So when we try to justify our behavior because of someone else's behavior, now we're in trouble. But when I describe what's going on in that situation, I at least stand a fighting chance to figure out how to change it. But if I won't describe it because I'm afraid of blaming somebody, it probably won't change. Okay, number 3. I stand my ground am I being mean? The guidepost of power. And what that means is not power over or power against. Brene Brown talked a little bit about this with Karen Horney's material. But it's not a matter of power over anybody else. So when the most fundamental, and you guys all know this, the most fundamental boundary word in our vocabulary is the hardest 2-letter word ever for somebody to say. No. Why? Because we're afraid somebody's going to feel bad, or that we're afraid that they're going to feel rejected, or. So standing my ground and saying no is not being mean. Now, People play that card with us for one main reason. They want to talk you out of your boundaries. Do they know that? No, they don't. They just don't like no more than you or I do. But if I want to cultivate clear boundaries, consistent boundaries, and be able to engage in a relationship with somebody in any kind of healthy way, I have to develop the boundaries enough to say no at times, to communicate that. Because the outgrowth of all of this stuff happens whenever I marry a couple, and I say to them one main thing: because boundaries are so important, they allow you to own yourself. And at the wedding day, you cannot give away something you have never owned. That's why boundaries are so important. And it comes to culmination in a wedding day, when two people covenant what they have owned to the other. And that's the beauty of it. That truly is the beauty of it in a lot of ways. So boundaries end up being even more important than we would imagine. Number 2. So if I take responsibility for myself, is that okay? The key is myself, not everyone else. In a lot of cases, we take responsibility for everybody else because we're not so sure how to take responsibility for ourselves, or it's just we're afraid of failure. We're afraid that we won't do it right. So the key oftentimes that gets kind of gives us away is defensiveness. Because in a lot of cases, shame, as it says up here, shame is lurking in the background, waiting for that fear that if I take responsibility for myself, caring for my heart, doing all the things that I have been talking about all this time, the fear is I will suffer disconnection. I will suffer disapproval. I will suffer rejection. I will suffer fill in the blank. So there are lots of things that get in the way of us taking responsibility for ourselves. And that is not a selfish thing to do, is the thing that I am called to do, is take care of your heart. Guard your heart, for above all else, above all other things, because it's a wellspring of life, and out of that everything flows. So in a lot of cases, when somebody it gives us feedback, and it's an example where we haven't taken responsibility, and then I get defensive, that's probably the voice of shame that is saying, oh, there you did it again. You have failed again. Here we go. We know what this is going to lead to. Versus backing off on the pedal, tapping the brakes a few times and saying, okay, help me understand what I've done here. That's inviting more shame if you're going to work from shame. It's inviting more change if you're going to work from grace. Yeah.
Is shame what's present when we feel like we need to apologize for our boundaries and taking responsibility?
Well, it maybe. I mean, maybe. I think a lot of times we feel bad because we have boundaries, and that's usually is not true guilt. I haven't done anything wrong by having boundaries, but it's false guilt. I haven't lived up to somebody else's expectations, which would be just a kissing cousin to shame. I've done something wrong. I'm being bad. All of that. So yeah, I can. I mean, a lot of times, at the drop of a hat, you apologize for your existence. That's shame. And it shows up in a lot of different ways that way. So I think the biggest challenge of this class, and I'm, whoever else is watching this thing, I think the biggest challenge is we in a sense, we can't see the forest for the trees. We are in a forest of shame. And so we're trying to pick out the trees here, but we really don't see beyond it. And it's my effort here in doing something like this is to try to create a bigger horizon so we can see that there are freedom places out there that I can wander my way out of this forest that I'm in and be able to act freely with boundaries and all the other things that we're talking about in this class. So we've already mentioned the shame. The voice of shame oftentimes is you will always be what you've always been and you'll always do what you've always done. That's the prediction of shame. Grace creates this space so I can actually grow. No. All right, number one. Farming can be a great way to make a living and to live a life. The guidepost here is of reaping and sowing. Actually, sowing and reaping. Letting others suffer the consequences for their action is not being mean or ungracious. It is actually the most loving thing to do. The hardest part about having boundaries and being engaged in this commitment to living fully out of our own heart and owning our own heart and taking care of it and caring for it sometimes means that I am the consequence. So somebody does something that is entirely insensitive and really rude or very offensive or hurts a lot, and I won't say something to them because what? I don't want them to feel bad. The problem with it is, in this context, is I am saving them from consequences that they could actually learn to do it differently. How often have we blown by people doing really insensitive things and just said, it's no big deal. Yeah, whatever. It doesn't bother me. Sure, but whatever. And versus saying, time out. That really hurt. What you said. I don't get it. Now, the minute that happens in a relationship, both people are running for the exits. Both people are running for the exits. Because why? They're afraid it's going to blow up the relationship, right? Which is ironic because they're both running for the exits and they're blowing up the relationship. But I think, I firmly believe that the stuff of intimacy that we will be talking the last week, intimacy is born out of being honest enough to let the other person that we care about suffer consequences. What are the consequences? How it affects me. And whatever we sow, we will reap. If we sow superficiality, blowing past comments, denial, all these other things, we will reap a lack of intimacy in the relationship. Eventually, maybe not immediately, but eventually. I've seen those couples too, 20 years down the road, and they've been blown past all this stuff and dancing around it, doing the two porcupines on a cold winter's night gig, where they get too close, they poke each other. Too far away, they don't have enough warmth, so they find just the right distance to be warm enough but not poke each other. I've seen a lot of marriages like that. I don't ever tell them that. That'd be really insensitive and offensive for me to do, but the people that where there's smoke, there's really important fire in a relationship. And a lot of times, the messiness of relationships may not betray that anything's wrong. It may betray that these people are actually being honest with each other. And that's a whole nother talk in terms of talking about conflict and what that looks like. So, just as a reminder, in everything, Jesus said, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. He also said, you want to love other people as you love yourself, and usually I get my most snarky self out of that one when I say, thank God we don't do that. We'd never have any friends. Because the interior dialogue, if we were actually to bring it out when somebody made a mistake or didn't perform or didn't say the right thing or whatever, like we do with ourselves, oh, heaven forbid what that would look like. So let me take just a second, because we're going into another really heavy one. But let me just take a second and see what your guys' reactions or questions do you have around this topic. There's lots to understand. When I had my recovery ministry, we actually did boundaries. We did them a little bit like a college course. There was the 101, which is what you guys got, and then we went to 201, which was diving deeper into what this was like, and then 301 and 401. 401 usually is around confrontation. 401's tough stuff. It is really difficult stuff. And John and Henry knew that, and they released another boundaries book. It was probably about 10 years after they released the first one, and it was called Boundaries Face to Face. And it was about handling confrontation and all that. Yeah.
So when you're in a relationship and someone is going through something, a sickness, mental or physical, where you need to collapse some of your boundaries in order to care for them, or parts of the relationship that person just can't do right now, do you call that collapsing your boundaries?
No.
Or would that just be...
No, I wouldn't. I would say opening the gate and going in and helping somebody with theirs. And the way you describe it is the way a lot of people describe it. Is instead of, I'm operating from a volitional free point of view. I open my gate to go out to help somebody else. That is not collapsing boundaries. The fence is still intact. I still have a lot of decisions to make about kind of finessing. How can I empower the other person and yet carry what they can't carry? And so there's a lot of gray area in there, I think, that most people struggle with, to know exactly how. There is not an exactly how. It's not going to be precise. It's not going to be perfect. But if it's close, it's better than the alternative. So yeah, I wouldn't see it as collapsing boundaries. Other questions? You guys have bumped into this thing.
Where do you find a balance between not seeing someone doing something dumb to hurt them and letting them prove they so?
Dumb to hurt themselves. Is that what you're talking about?
Something what you're doing is not helpful to yourself.
Well, I mean, again, I would probably see that as a conversation across the fence line. To use the metaphor, is that when I'm in relationship with somebody that's doing something damaging to themselves or whatever else, I mean, outside of trying to kill themselves, literally, then all bets are off on that one, because I need to intervene, and that's. But still, I don't see that as collapsing boundaries. A little bit like Cam was talking about. But going to your point, I think I can give people a lot of feedback about that. The choices that they're making that are damaging themselves, and they're in relationship with me, and I care about them, then there's an impact on me of their behavior. A lot of times when people start doing self-damaging things, they don't think at all about the consequences to anyone else, unless they're trying to make a point to somebody, which is possible. So, I think that, but we usually, when we're seeing somebody doing something that's really damaging or damaging at all, we want to fix it, and that we end up lapsing into doing something that is not very empowering for the other person. So the empowerment part of that is giving them feedback, perhaps helping them find resources or doing something like that, and offering to help them get there, and those kinds of things. That's empowerment. That's not taking over. And so, and I think that's kind of the finesse again of it. The issue is when I want somebody's safety more than they want their safety, then suddenly I'm going to get involved in something I have no power over, because I can't be with them 24 hours a day. And so there's always going to be that part of people have the freedom to choose, which means they have the freedom to choose wrongly. and rightly. And as long as I'm committed to that, then it's not so much that they're doing something that hurts me, they're doing something that hurts them, and that saddens me, but it doesn't become something that I feel for them. So there's a lot of kind of, our language gets in our way, I think, a lot of times. But most of the time, we're not talking about people doing something that's self-harming to the point of killing themselves. They may be blowing up a relationship, or they may be engaged in drinking behavior or other behaviors that's blowing up their relationships. But really, literally, all I can do is give them feedback about the effect on my relationship with them and let them choose. And essentially then, at some point in time, the person continues to choose, then I may need to distance myself, but it doesn't mean I have to absent myself. Distance is not the same as absence. But that's not a punishing act. As long as I'm having this dialogue with the person, I think it's different entirely. Does that kind of get to what you're wondering, John? Yeah.
How do you get over, like, you were talking about how you need to be able to tell people when they hurt you and just be open about that, but how do you get over the anxiety that comes with that? And like, when you say like you have to like allow them to feel like the effects of them hurting you, like how do you get over like it feeling like it's punishing yourself? Like, and like for me, I just have so much anxiety with any confrontations. It's like where does that come from, and then how do you get over it?
Yeah, but that's a much longer conversation, Grace. I mean, how-tos, I'm not going to give you much in the way of how-tos anyway. But at the same time, I think it's a longer kind of exploration about how I'm calibrating my value, my worth, in terms of somebody else's reaction to it. So that means I've got to do something with that in order to tamp down some of the anxiety. Will it ever go away? I don't know. I think everybody feels some form of angst when they're confronting somebody else about something. Everybody does. So, but I don't know that rises to the level of anxiety per se. We experience it that way. It's not debilitating or anything like that. But, I think that's kind of the key, is that more often than not, most paths lead me back to my well. Not to what should I do in order to keep everybody happy, or what. It always leads back to what I do in my well. So, any other questions? Okay, I probably had enough. See you next week.